And I like this illustration particularly because here is Columbus with his Arabic-style astrolabe being greeted by one of the native Arawak Indians in her hammock, another invention of the Caribbean natives. And then beyond her welcome, maybe she was welcoming him to share the feast up there, and a little human leg there. And of course, this era is a lot of fantasy of who these people were, whether they were really cannibals or not. It's a whole other story. But nonetheless, he went back and he became the toast of Europe, and fantastic news that you could sail west to come to what they thought was Asia. So here again is a picture of Isabella greeting him with a few Native Americans there in the entourage, all of which who probably never got back home. But meanwhile, Columbus is sort of a mysterious figure because it's said that he was perhaps born in Genoa, but he actually was raised in Rhodes, off the Turkish coast now, and then he wrote in a kind of Greek and Latin, Christopheres, which means the bearer of Christ. And so it's unknown really maybe who he was beyond his appearances, but he then was given this royal crest of the seal of Castilla and Leon, admiral of the ocean seas and all the islands he discovered, which led to his conflict with other Spanish over who was going to own and run this new empire. One thing that has been proposed is that actually he was a converso Jew at the time when Ferdinand and Isabella were driving all the Jews out of Spain, and what he was really looking for was a new homeland for his Jewish compatriots who were being, of course, expulsed at the time. But that's just speculation. There's no evidence that's what his real motive. But meanwhile, he made 4 different voyages across, went to South America, discovered the Caribbean coast, and meanwhile hit at the Santo Domingo, the main capital for the exploration of this whole world. There were battles with other following ships. Now, this was, of course, the Spanish kingdom sent many ships and many people to look for gold and to begin colonizing. This is a recreation of one of his last voyages, flagship called the Santa Misa Trinidad, which is in the port of Malaga when I was there a little while ago. But that's probably the biggest ship ever built at that time. Of course, now it's just a restaurant club. But you can imagine going off to the Caribbean with all of its islands and, let's say, hazards of weather and such. And so how many hidalgos, which in Spanish literally means the son of somebody. People would go out for adventuring even if they had no capital, maybe come back rich, maybe be lost. But that's the nature of the era. This is the first map made of the Caribbean by Jose de la Costa, one of the navigators under Columbus in 1500. And of course, the rest of South America and North America was not known then. But more ships came, and the rush was on, and as Sir Walter Raleigh said, it was Indian gold that drove Europe mad and began all the competition and conflict there. In this case, the Caribe Indians fighting off more colonists coming and landing on whichever island it was, many of whom were enslaved, put to work, and died. And then that began the era of importing African slaves to work in the tropics for the sugarcane, etc. And others followed. Ponce de Leon left from Cuba, went up to discover Florida, looking for the proverbial fountain of youth, which I think is still there, somewhere outside of Palm Beach. But Columbus himself, he came to a conflict with the governor of that was sent to Santo Domingo, and he was imprisoned, taken back to Spain. He was absolved of the charges, but that was the time that someone had him write down his memoirs. And then he died in Sevilla, and he's said to be buried in a monastery outside of the old town of Sevilla. But others have said that his family took his body back to Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic, not Cuba. And the Balaguer regime about 20 years ago built a monument to Columbus as the founder of the New World communities, and they built what they call Faro de Colón, which is the lighthouse of Columbus, and it's this tremendous big park structure that is designed by an English architect in the form of a sort of a Brutusque cathedral with his tomb, and he's said that his remains are said to be there. But to this day, the government of Dominican Republic and the Spanish government refused to do DNA testing on what's in the tomb. So here's Columbus. He has 2 tombs, and perhaps he's still out there sailing around. Nobody knows where he really is taking a rest. But at night in Santo Domingo, they light up the great light of the faro of Columbus, and they light up the sky like that. And every time it happens, it blacks out all of the rest of the city. So it's a contradiction like many things in the world. Well, anyway, I'll just go on to other explorers. Here's Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese leader who came around Cape Hope and then came up the African coast, landed at numerous places, including Mombasa. He then went to Malindi, where he was received by the Sultan, who gave him the services of the Arab pilot Ahmed bin Majid. And then he continued over to India and to Calicut. Now, we were just there. That's near Cochin. And this began the expansion of the Portuguese Empire across Asia. And my colleague Philip Hurst is going to talk about that in specific in a couple of days. But here's a Japanese screen illustrating the Portuguese who came in to their designated trading post at Nagasaki. And this is the view of these strange Europeans and their strange ships coming in this case riding elephants, which had never been seen in Japan before. And then they had African servants, and this fellow is particularly taking it easy. I'm not sure. He's probably the head chef or something on the ship. But this is the extension of European culture all across to the other side of the world. Now, meanwhile, the Italian Amerigo Vespucci, who was working for the Medicis, signed on to the Spanish ships that were going to the Caribbean, and he then led an expedition on the coast of Brazil all the way down to Patagonia, the first European to go there. And this is an illustration where he sighted the Southern Cross, which if you've been down there, there's a constellation that stands as a cross. And he took that as a sign that God meant that Christianity should spread to these far ends of the world. And he went down to the north coast of Brazil and back up to the Caribbean. And then Cabral came and continued going down the Brazilian coast. Here's an Italian map from Portuguese, 1502, that has illustrations of the wildlife in Brazil. And then they continued down the coast of Rio de Janeiro and further down. But of course, it's a long, long way. And the Portuguese, by right, considered Brazil to be their land because of an agreement called the Treaty of Tordesillas, which divided the world between the Spanish and Portuguese, according to Pope Leo the 11th. Now, this is the Portuguese seal finally at that area, where they had Europa, the symbol of Europe, with the Native Americans as part of the Portuguese Empire. Alfonso de Albuquerque was a military officer who then went after Vasco da Gama and established Goa and other settlements, Cochin, Malacca, and again spread the Portuguese Empire, mainly a trading empire. They never sent many colonists there, but the last of the Portuguese enclaves, of course, was Macau, which was just returned to China after how many? 450 years. The other Portuguese sailor of renown is Ferdinand Magellan, Magellanes, many pronunciations of his name, but he was a Portuguese nobleman who had been in military action in North Africa and then proposed to the King João II that he could take a journey around the other way, meaning going down the Atlantic and around the Americas, and come to determine where the line of division of the Treaty of Tordesillas would be. That green line would be the antipode to the division of the Atlantic, which left Brazil as part of Portugal, and the rest being Spanish. But in this case, that antipode in Asia was unknown, and this became a controversy at the time, being because they didn't really know how big the world was. And so what was a league and how many leagues there were to go to the Spice Islands and determine which could be Portuguese and which could be Spanish was the issue at the time. So in 1519, he petitioned King Charles V to sponsor an expedition to go around South America, to go to Asia, and then determine this important question of who would own these the Spice Islands, which were, of course, the goal at the time with the cost of those expensive things then. Now, this is an illustration. You see all these Portuguese flags claiming different islands. But King Charles V, being the Habsburg king of Spain at the time, he wanted a slice of them, so he listened to Magellan. And one of the points that Magellan made was that there had been other people who had gone around South America before. Now, this is the Piri Reis map that's in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, and it shows clearly the South American coast. It's not north-south here. That's Cape Hope, Africa. And then further down, there's more islands and a passageway there. And this is what Magellan said, that others had been there and they knew about it. But the question is, who had gone down there? Was it Turkish? Because Piri Reis is actually the admiral of the Turkish Navy. It may have been the Chinese, may have been other Arabs, but nonetheless, Magellan said he thinks it was possible, so he took his 5 ships and went down and found the strait that bears his name to this day and got through it. Now, this is a very adventuresome story. I'm going to have a talk just about this voyage next week sometime. But then when he finally came out into the Pacific, he realized that he had gotten around this great obstruction of the American continents. And then he continued 99 days across the Pacific, again with a crew on the verge of starvation and mutiny. He finally landed in Guam and the Philippines, where he was attacked by some natives that did not want him to convert them, and he was famously slaughtered in the beach with his armor on. He did not make it, but one of his ships made it all the way back, the Victoria, and became the first ship to go all the way around, the first circumnavigator. And again, there's a lot of detail in this I'll talk to another day. Now, meanwhile, the other Europeans were getting ready to find the way to Asia. Here's an English effort out of Bristol by John Cabot, whose real name was Giuseppe van Caboto, from Genoa. And he went and found Newfoundland and came back and said there's a great passage there. He went out on a second expedition and disappeared. Meanwhile, the French were getting into this, also here Jacques Cartier, who then led an expedition off to discover the St. Lawrence River and Canada. And here's the first map of that region, up to Quebec, up to eastern Canada now. Then the Italians continued with Giovanni de Verrazzano, who, working for the French, came to find again a passage up. He sailed across, was the first to go into the Chesapeake Bay, New York Harbor, and then go up to Newfoundland. And so this attempt to try to define the world was then put into cartography, and then other people could follow. Here's the Waldseemüller map of 1524, which is curious because it has the isometric display, which is a cartographic effort to try to have proper distances, even though that the image is cut up, but it has the first reference particularly to America, which is reputedly after Amerigo de Vespucci, who had been there, and his name was attached to maps, and that's where we get the name of the Americas now. But there are other parts of this map that are curious, particularly the name, a later map of Wilfried, a Dutch navigator, calls America Suvi India Novo, the new India, which is not completely true, but it did have the St. Lawrence River here, Shilaga, which I think is the old name for Chicago, and then the West Coast, including the Gulf of California, and then other parts, Anyan, which was up on the upper corner. That was said to be the passage to Asia that other navigators would try to explore later, especially Captain Cook. But at this time, in the late 1500s, the Spanish still ruled most of the world. Philip II was the richest, most powerful emperor of his era, and of course he sent out more expeditions, famously Cortez Pizarro to South America, and the gold and silver of the Americas enriched Spain and created quite a bit of economic turmoil in Europe. But that was also sent back out with more ships, more colonists. Here's around South Africa again, all the way to Asia, and trading posts in Vietnam, China, Japan, and the Malacca and the Spice Islands. And so this was, in many ways, the first world empire, particularly in 1580 when the Portuguese and Spanish royalty married together, and so it was a unified empire until 1660. And so this was unmatched in the world, that European countries would control all these places and all these continents. And of course the competition then followed. Here is El Drago in Spanish, but Sir Francis Drake, who then attacked the Spanish fleets, and the battles in particularly the Caribbean happened, and then this launched the age of piracy, which was essentially based upon competition for the riches of the world and competition between the European powers. So I found this illustration, Sir Francis Drake calling upon this dull or effeminate age to follow his noble steps for gold and silver. And this is the stuff of many a swashbuckling movie and some scholarship to see whether he was a good, let's say, agent of Queen Elizabeth I, or whether he was yet another bloody pirate. But his ship, the Golden Hind, went around to Peru and attacked the galleons of the Spanish. Now, this particular reproduction ship went around the world to recreate his voyage, but then foundered a few years ago off of Dartmouth in South England. And but he was definitely the most, let's say, bracing of adventurers and explorers at the time. He was also the second to circumnavigate the world after Magellan. Well, the last of the great explorers, I'd say, is Captain James Cook, who, of course, is well known to most of you, and particularly in Australia because of his, in New Zealand because of his discoveries there. This is a very fanciful illustration of his approaching New Zealand, being greeted by the Maori. But again, the subject of a whole nother detailed talk, but he made 3 epic voyages around the world, discovered much of Polynesia, New Zealand, and routes through the islands, and then passed Cape Horn twice, went down to Antarctica and almost got caught in the ice. And then his last voyage, he went up and tried to find the Northwest Passage through the Bering Sea. And he went from Hawaii up and was along the northwest coast of North America to Alaska, Siberia, Kamchatka, and such. But again, that's a whole nother adventuresome story, and they've rebuilt his ship, the Endeavour, which is sailing out of Australia these days. But he met his end in Hawaii in 1778 because he had to repair rigging that was not in good shape, and he could not sail back up north to continue his exploration. And in his own journal, before he left on his 3rd voyage, he watched the Royal Navy being equipped with all of the best equipment and rigging in particular to go to suppress the rebellion in the colonies in America. And in his own journal, he said that if I am shortchanged in my equipment because of the trouble in the Americas, I may not make it back, which is what happened. He came ashore, and because of some disputes with the local Hawaiians, they attacked and actually chopped him up there on the beach. And so perhaps if there hadn't been the American Revolution, he would have been better equipped and made it back to England. But that's my own speculation. Well, this age of exploration then followed on to lead to what we have as our modern world. And I just list a few things for you to consider, that after this era, all major world cultures were in contact, and ships were the essential means of communication, of course, trade and transport. And all these places, the Americas, India, Asia, and Africa, were all colonized, as Philip Hearst talked about Africa. But Islam, above all, was contained, impoverished, and disunified, as was China. These great cultures or civilizations were no match to the imposition of the technical improvements, nautical military science from Europe. And Europe itself was transformed from a local economy to a global economy with all the new materials, fibers for the Industrial Revolution. And it also caused political evolution from what I call a feudal royalty to a bourgeois democracy. And the leadership of society was by science and economics and not religion as in medieval times. And all these products became widely available, not so expensive, including pepper. And then we had all this new food, the maize, corn, potato, tomato, chilies, chocolate, all came from the other world, including some vices being chicle, tobacco, and coca, as in cocaine. And on the downside, all these diseases spread around. But generally, the population grew all around the world because of food supply and then advanced medical knowledge, leading to what we have now, all this cultural exchange, migration, mixing, and our now global economic interdependence with all of its conflicts and troubles, but also a great prosperity for humanity due to these explorers who dared to go out and find the world. And so now you might say, well, what is the exploration these days? Well, I'll just give you one example. So far, we haven't found any new continents, at least not on this cruise. But I have a friend who built this schooner and then wanted to have the world's longest sailing around the world without reprovisioning for 1,000 days. That's over 3 years. Well, he ended up leaving with his Indian wife and they sailed out of New York Harbor, packed with food. They went out off of Bermuda, were run down by a freighter, and then they spent a month at sea repairing their ship. The hull was not damaged, just his forerig was taken off, including his great tiki that he had carved. And then they went off all the way down to the Southern Ocean, went to Australia, and by that time, she had never gone sailing before, by the way. And then she ended up being so sick she could not get out of her bed and was deteriorating so bad, she couldn't handle the seas at all. And so he had to call for medevac out of Perth, and they took her off, and they found that she suffered from the medical ailment that only women get at sea. Anybody know what that is? Yeah, she was pregnant. Oh, good to talk to real adults here. Anyway, well, she went ashore and had a baby, and then meanwhile he went off on his expedition for 3 years solo at sea. And some people were complaining, oh, well, what kind of a fellow would take a young woman to sea, get her pregnant, put her ashore, and keep sailing? Well, he's a sailor. And anyway, he did come back, and we brought him into the harbor, and when he arrived, his wife and the little kid were there, but he could not speak. He had lost the ability to speak, which is not my problem, of course. But now he's back home in Carolina, living on the boat, having gone around the world. And he said, had he been French, he would have been a national hero. But in the United States, people just thought he was crazy. But he's very crazy, but he's a great sailor. He handled this schooner for 3 years all by himself. He had a little hydroponic garden on board. He had fresh vegetables. As a sailboat, you gather fish to follow around. He would dive and pick up algae and catch a few fish. And so he said he was perfectly happy at sea, and he only came back to land because he had his wife and child that he wanted to see again. Well, anyway, that's not exactly discovering anything new, but that's sort of an example of, we all have curiosity that can be expressed in different ways, if not out at sea. And so, the human spirit is indomitable if you really want to do something. And I'm a sailor. This is one vessel that I take out on my busman's holiday. It's an old English Channel sail ferry from 1924 that we raised from the bottom of the Connecticut River. And someday we're going to go on a great expedition across the Atlantic and rediscover Britain, take it back home to Falmouth. And so that's actually seaworthy, but somehow, again, the accommodations are not quite as comfortable as on this ship. And this is another vessel, the Heraclitus that I work with, which is a research vessel that has been around the world 10 times very slowly, just like the Chinese junks have passed. And so I leave you with a last thought about exploration of Yeats. Only those who go too far can know how far one can go. And I wish you great explorations in your own time. Bon voyage. Thank you very much.